Hello, and welcome to another Cybercast from Detour Books. I'm Sammy Keats, and today I'm here with Professor Justin Cammy, a literary and cultural historian of Yiddish literature and Eastern European Jewish history. He's also a distinguished professor of Jewish studies and world literature at Smith College. Professor Cammy is here to discuss and read from his new translation of Avrom Sutzkever's Memoir, From the Vilna Ghetto to Nuremberg, a memoir and testimony, published this past October by McGill-Queen's University Press. In full disclosure, Professor Cammy and I met at the Yiddish Book Center in 2014 when I saw him with his hands in the till, and I ran over to see who he was, and then found out that he was just looking something up on the computer. Welcome, Justin, and thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Sammy.
First, let me say congratulations on this new work. It must be very satisfying and certainly a culmination of long study of Sutscover's work and life.
It is. I mean, I've been working on Sutscover since even before I was a graduate student. I read him for the first time when I was an undergraduate in Canada. So to be able to publish something that has been hidden from the public, from the English reading public for 75 years is really a fulfillment of a lot of work and thinking that I've been doing over the past several decades.
Well, it's very rich to read. I mean, it reads like a novel. And my first question is, how was Sutzkever able to achieve the flow of this narrative? Can you talk a little bit about his writing process here?
Sure. I mean, Sutzkever was commissioned to write a memoir of the Vilna Ghetto by none other than the great Soviet Jewish writers, Ilya Ehrenberg and Vasily Grossman. So these are not, these are two major figures who, after his rescue from the partisan forests in late March 1943, and not 1944, invited him to contribute to the Black Book Project. And his contribution was meant to be a contribution on the Vilna Ghetto. So he wrote a draft of this almost breathlessly between April and the midsummer of 1944. And when Vilna was liberated in mid-July 1944, he rushed back to town and added a final chapter on liberation. So we might think of this memoir as somewhere between a diary, because a diary is written as events are going on without perspective, and something of a later memoir in which you're able to think back on a particular series of experiences. He didn't have a lot of time to think back. This memoir is written even before the war is over, and within weeks of Vilna's liberation, it's almost complete, or at least drafted. So this is how he writes in a way that's almost in the style of Soviet reportage, in the style of an eyewitness. And it's not only Sutzkever's voice we hear in this memoir, but also the voice of so many other people he encounters or remembers encountering from the ghetto. It's a polyvocal text that really brings that experience to light.
So would you please read the opening passage?
Sure. The opening passage of the memoir is called "In the City and on the Road." When I turned on the radio the morning of June 22nd, 1941, a hysterical German scream leapt out at me like a pack of lizards. From the clamor, I realized that the German army had crossed the border. I darted outside, eager for a familiar face. I came across Noach Palutsky, professor of Yiddish studies at Vilnius University. He was absorbed in his research on Yiddish phonetics. Hitler began to dig his own grave with the first bomb dropped on Russian territory, Palutsky prophesied, but he had no advice about what we ought to do. He turned back to his work. Firefighters rushed through the streets. A fire was burning next to the Green Bridge. I turned towards Mother's home, which was located just beyond the bridge. She was relieved to see me. She showered me with kisses and tried to assure me that everything would be all right. She prepared a sorrel soup for me and added in some cream. The bombs continued to fall relentlessly. Across the Valia River, a gas reservoir was on fire. The smell made it all the way into our little room and tore at our throats.
visceral. So I'm thinking about, in terms of being published in translation, I've read that other Yiddish writers sought to be translated as part of one of the aspects of being published. But Sutzkever was not motivated to do this, and I wondered why.
Well, I wouldn't say that he wasn't motivated to be translated in general. Certainly, he had no problem having his poetry translated. But for this particular volume, the Soviet context of its composition made him somewhat distance himself from it. He later said that almost everything he had to say about the war years was contained in his poetry and his short fiction. So it's almost like a forgotten document because of the context of its composition, written as it was between Vilnius and Moscow, written as it was under the supervision of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee, written as it was in the aftermath, having been chosen by the Soviet authorities to represent the Soviet Union as an official witness at Nuremberg. So Sutzkever, in a way, as he continued on in his career and as the Cold War continued, never sought to have this book republished. It was translated into Hebrew very early on, and also into French very early on. But then it went almost dormant. He never talked about it. He never referred to it in his anthology of Holocaust writings. And when one thinks about it, now that there have been new translations of this particular work in different languages, and finally now in English, this is coming on the 75th anniversary of the book's initial publication in Moscow and in Paris. They were both published almost simultaneously in 1946, and on the 75th anniversary of his testimony at Nuremberg, which I also include in the volume, and also include his diary notes from his testimony at Nuremberg, and also include, sort of making this a full volume of its moment, memoirs of his relationship with Nuremberg, which really was the beginning or the source for this memoir.
Huh. And I know his testimony is part of some of the documentary films that are out more recently, but can you also get that testimony on YouTube? Do you know? Does it exist there?
The parts of the testimony exist there. The full testimony, the full video testimony exists at the International Criminal Court. But I think most of it is there, except for some short edits. What I decided to do for this volume was to include the entirety of the testimony as it was transcribed from Sutzkever's Russian into English by the official court stenographer. So I translated everything else in the volume myself, except for his Russian testimony. I wanted to include that official court translation in order to provide that sense of evidence of this as an evidentiary document. And that also was quite an interesting story that we talk about in our afterword, namely that Sutscover really wanted to testify in Yiddish. It was his main hope. And that hope was denied by the authorities, mainly because Yiddish wasn't an official language of the court. So he had to end up testifying in Russian. And his Russian, of course, wasn't nearly as good as either his Yiddish or his Polish, or perhaps even his Hebrew. But nonetheless, it's an amazing testimony.
Well, speaking about his Yiddish, one of the translators in the film Black Honey, The Poetry and Life of Avrom Sutzkever, described Sutzkever's Yiddish as the most sophisticated ever written. And I wondered, what did he mean by that? You know, you think of a language being used in the same way by all its speakers and readers, but not with Yiddish. Why is that so?
I think that Sutzkever made use of the different registers of Yiddish. And that may be one of the clues. It wasn't only the experimental modernism of his Yiddish. It wasn't only the way in which he experimented musically with the Yiddish, especially in his poetry, but especially in being conscious of the different levels of Yiddish historically. In a way, he comes at the very culmination of several centuries of Yiddish literary creativity. And it's no accident, I think, that he decides to study old Yiddish literature with none other than Max Weinreich, the dean, the director of the YIVO Institute in Vilnius. So why would a poet, sort of at the beginning of his career, take time out of his writing to study the very origins of literary Yiddish and the Yiddish language, if not because he saw Yiddish as that essential tool for his creativity. And if you're going to be an artist, if you're going to be creative, you need to know all the different aspects of that tool and everything you can do with it. So he needed to know its historical resonances. He needed to investigate its Lashon Kodesh or its Hebraic references. He needed to be familiar with its Slavic references. He was very interested in Polish Romantic literature, which informed how he would shape his Yiddish as well. So all of these different levels and influences, I think, play into a sophistication, not only in his ideas, not only in his artistry, but also in his basic linguistic interests in his writing.
Mm-hmm. And about the shape of the volume itself, why did you choose to pair the translations of the Ghetto Memoir with the diary notes from Nuremberg and essays about Jewish writers he met in Moscow from 1944 to 46? I know you spoke of this a little bit earlier, but maybe you can go into more detail.
Well, it's a great question because first of all, the Yiddish editions themselves, there's two different Yiddish versions of this, one published in Moscow, another published in Paris. They're almost the same, but there are significant differences. And I bring the two of them together in this volume so you can see those differences. But I also think that all writers write within a context, a political context, a cultural context. And I wanted to recuperate the moment in which this memoir was written. That is, where was he? Who was he talking to? What was on his mind? We know that the almost 2 years that he spends in Moscow after his rescue from the forest is this feverish time for him. He's trying to edit his ghetto poems. He's trying to rescue materials along with some of his surviving peers that had been buried in the Vilna Ghetto. And then he has this added burden of having been asked by the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to write this memoir. So I thought it was important to also include those Moscow years. So there's an essay there about Ehrenberg, an essay there about the great Yiddish poet Peretz Markish, an essay there about the Yiddish theater director Shlomo Michols, in a way to show what he was dealing with, the idea of censorship, official censorship, and also self-censorship. How was he navigating the pressures of working in the sort of the last years of the war and then the early years of the post-war period when Stalinist policy actually changes. And then the culmination of that will come in 1946 when he has this intense responsibility that he feels when he's asked to testify at Nuremberg. And in those diary notes that he publishes years later, we see the degree to which he worried about whether his testimony would be up to the task. So I think all of those things together produce a translation that is not only the memoir of the ghetto, but the memoir of the moment in writing the memoir of the ghetto. And in a way, one might have called it Sutskever's Moscow years. That would be another way of thinking about the volume. This brief window in his creative life.
Now, I know you've chosen a few passages that you'd like to read. Do you want to read from one of those now?
Sure. So here is a passage from his Nuremberg, his diary notes about his testimony at Nuremberg.
Okay.
Nuremberg, at the trial, 11:45 a.m., Wednesday, February 27th, 1946. I have just concluded my testimony before the Nuremberg tribunal. The words are still glowing on my lips, words that I shrieked out before the entire world and for future generations. I was shaken to my very core. It was without question the most powerful experience of my 30-some years of life. I spoke for 38 minutes. It cannot be other than the divine providence who put Russian into my mouth. I myself was not certain that I would manage to express my full feelings and memories in that language. It's still difficult for me to take stock of my feelings. Which is stronger, my sorrow or my desire for revenge? It seems to me that greater than either is the radiant, powerful feeling that our people lives, that it has outlived its executioners, and that no dark force can annihilate us. In a Jewish twist of fate, a Yiddish poet, perhaps the only one still alive from the ghettos of Europe, has come to Nuremberg to cast judgment on the Rosenbergs and the Franks, and in so doing, perhaps also on the surviving remnants of fascism in other countries.
Mm. Yeah, so what we're learning is that this is a very multifaceted memoir. It's not just a straight ahead, uh, uh, overview of a person's life or even a period in a person's life, but it has all of these layers to it. It's
Indeed.
very rich. So finally, I'm thinking about the opening in your introduction for Richard Fine's book, The Full Pomegranate Poems of Avrom Sutzkever, when you wrote, "I owe my career to Avrom Sutzkever." And it made me wonder, how has your study of Sutzkever affected your own life and work?
Well, in so many ways. I would say, first of all, the idea that language is fate and responsibility to language. That language is not just something that we use to communicate, but it's a doorway to an entire culture. So what does it mean for someone like Sutzkever to be born into a culture where language is natural, where language is everywhere, only to have that taken away violently and suddenly, and then to see oneself almost as responsible for its rebuilding and its reshaping. This is an amazing story that we have of a poet who in his teens and in his 20s really wanted to be left alone, was not political at all, and then finds himself in this extraordinary situation where he becomes the voice of the ghetto, and then finds himself once again in this extraordinary situation of being one of these surviving remnants that rebuilds Yiddish culture after the war, not in Europe, not in America, but in the state of Israel, which had its own vexed relationship with Yiddish. So what does it mean to be a Yiddish writer in the Hebrew-speaking state, and to position yourself and your city of Tel Aviv, as the sort of central point for discourse, high-level discourse of Yiddish culture, so that the journal you found and the many dozens of volumes of poetry and prose you produce can become the touchstone for post-war Yiddish culture. To me, this is an extremely interesting, invigorating, and exciting model. And I would say it's true for my students as well. During the COVID pandemic, when my college, like many other colleges, went online, I decided that I wanted to offer a seminar for students. And for the first time in my career, I offered a seminar on Sutscover. You figure how many students at a small liberal arts college could be interested in someone like Sutscover. And first of all, the seminar was sold out because I think there was a thirst for poetry, a search for serious ideas that come from experience and ideas that come from a true artist. And the students were as excited as I was to read what it meant to be a poet in youth, and what you can produce in youth, and how that differs from what you can produce in maturity. They were excited by the ability to explore what we were talking about earlier, namely the different registers of Yiddish. They were excited, of course, to explore how Yiddish offers a different window into what we might think of as Holocaust literature that might be different from Holocaust literature written in non-Jewish languages that we're more familiar with, whether it be Anne Frank's Dutch or Primo Levi's Italian or Elie Wiesel's French and translated into English. What does it mean to respond to an event like this in and through a Jewish language as opposed to a European language? And they were also fascinated by the ways his Yiddish engages with the early years of the state of Israel, exploring the landscape of rebuilding at the same time that one is exploring the landscape of memory. So it's not that I only owe my career to him in terms of an interesting model to study, but I think he inspired me, and he continues to inspire my students who are fascinated by what he does. And that's endlessly fulfilling.
Yeah, that's really gratifying. Well, Justin, thanks again for joining us today and sharing your insights on this important work. And thanks to all of you out there in cyberspace. Go to Detour Books, buy the book, and see what else we have on offer. We are a source for world literature and English translation with a focus on Yiddish writers. We also have curated children's books, useful gifts, and coffee. So see you next time. Thanks again.
Thank you.